Fire Team member and Air Force veteran, Aaron Kleinman.
Test. There we go.
Kind of my
Good afternoon, everybody.
All right, well, we're going to go without a mic. I'll talk about it. Afternoon, everybody. My name is Aaron Kleinman. I'm one of the Health Vets lead proteges here today. I'm an Air Force veteran. I've served in Special Operations for a little bit. Got to fly, and actually it's a pleasure of mine to introduce this afternoon, thank you, Representative Adam Kinzinger.
Let's juggle them.
Representative Kinzinger has been elected to the House of Representatives in 2010, represents Illinois' 16th Congressional District. He's a fellow Air Force Guard member, and I'm proud to say he's a KC-135 pilot, and I flew RC-135, so we have some similar experiences. And then he flew RC-26s, and I flew U-28, so we have some special ops background, familiar with that. We both flew out on Hobart Field, possibly at the same time, don't know. Maybe we sat in the camera pit together. Well, it's a pleasure to introduce him, and he's going to talk to you briefly today and introduce the panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Hey guys, what's going on? Is that loud? Hello. I don't have to scream now. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I just want to give you a little bit of a talk about what it's like being a veteran in politics, and then why it's so important that we have veterans in politics and on the Hill to share your experience. I think one of the things, when you talk to people and you tell them that you're a veteran and you have a military background, sometimes people look at you like you have magical powers. A lot of the times they'll say, well, what's your view on what should happen in China or Syria and whatever? And I think just like anybody else, it's important to remember that we have opinions. It doesn't necessarily make us magic. We have a different experience than somebody has, and we sometimes have our opinions based on that experience. But I think what the really important part of being a veteran in Congress and on the Hill, no matter what capacity you are, is being able to bring a bigger picture to the importance of some of the debates we have. Let me give you an example. Right now, we have a government that's shut down, which is the stupidest, dumbest thing that we can ever do, ever, because politics has got to learn to work beyond shutting down governments, taking our toys and going home and pouting, right? Now, we can look and say, who's responsible for the government shutdown? That's a whole debate to have at some other point. But what we can do as veterans is look at this and go, you know what? When we were overseas and seeing pretty bad areas, when you were in Iraq, Afghanistan, somewhere in Africa, anywhere in your experience that this travel has taken you, you've truly seen what bad government actually is. And you've seen in a different perspective of how lucky we are to actually live where we live and have the opportunity to be able to govern ourselves. So while this is a bad example of government, it's also a pretty good example because, even though we're pouting and being children over on the Hill right now, the reality is we don't have a strong person, a dictator that comes in and dictates how we do things. We get to decide this as a country. We elect our own individuals that go there, and even though the system right now of politics is a little broken, the reality is we still get to make that determination. And so when you look at what experience you bring to the Hill, I'll tell you, when I talk to somebody that's a veteran and I'm trying to get advice or they work for me or do something, I know that they bring a unique experience that's more than being mired down in the issue of the moment, but can look at these issues from the broader perspective. If this process of not talking to each other and pouting and being children in Congress continues and grows and gets worse, we know that 10 or 20 or 30 years down the road, or maybe even sooner, it leads to a breakdown of constitutional republic and democracy, because we have to learn how to get things done in order to live in that kind of government. So we know the importance of doing adult things. And sometimes in the process of compromising, getting things done, or accepting a little something you don't want in order to function as a democracy. And so that's kind of an important perspective you can bring to the Hill too. And I think the reason this is so very important, the reason I'm passionate about this, and frankly the reason I ran for Congress, it's not because I really, all these issues we debate every day, they're important and I have opinions on them. But I think America plays a very unique role in this world. So if you think about from the very beginning of time, and I'm going to try to get into the mind of God for a moment, and he creates this world, and he knows that this human race is going to be fallen, and he knows that in the process of fallen humanity, there's going to be dictators, there's going to be people that kill people for sport, for politics, for any reason. He knows there's going to be oppression. He knows the evil that's going to exist. But he also knows that humanity should be capable of governing itself. So I think in kind of the ultimate sense of showing that, there's this country that's separated basically from the rest of the modern world at the time, where people come from all over, different races, different religions, different nationalities, come to this country called the United States of America and learn how to govern themselves. And frankly, if you would come from outer space, I think, and look at the earth and you would explain every country, I think looking at the earth, you would say, well, that's the country that will never work, the United States. Because look, nobody there is from the same background. Nobody, I mean, if you look at this, they're probably all going to be fighting each other. But yet we're the nation that got it together and is example to the rest of the world on how to do things, even though we have our little problems today. So I always think about, what is the mission of America? You don't hear politicians talk much about this, but probably many of you in this room think in terms of missions. You think in terms of objective. You think in terms of a purpose and why to do something. I'm going to throw out to you what I think the mission of America is. I think the mission of America is to be an example of self-governance to billions of people that don't have what we have, but are desperate for just a taste of it. So now you think about all the layers of what that unravels. So first off, self-governance, right? If you think about what happened when the Soviet Union existed, you had an Iron Curtain. You had generations of people behind the Iron Curtain that were oppressed. Humanity doesn't like to be oppressed, by the way. That's why people like Bashar al-Assad, even if in the short term he wins this, his days are numbered, because humans don't like to be oppressed. That's not something that just exists in the Western civilization. It exists everywhere. So if you look at what's going on, and you look at that example, in the Soviet Union, it wasn't necessarily just America's military or economy that defeated the Soviet Union. That was important. But what really happened is, behind the Iron Curtain, the second and third generation that grew up saw what it was like to live in America. And they made the decision that that's the kind of life they want to strive for too. And then ultimately, the Iron Curtain was torn down by the people behind it. The United States, without firing a direct single shot against the Soviet Union, was able to lead people through an example to a much better life. And that has paid off for us in dividends. Let's go to the cold economics of it. Now we have great trading relationships with Europe. We rebuilt Germany after World War II and Japan, and that relationship has paid off 100 or 200-fold economically versus what we invested. Think about South Korea. You all have seen the old satellite image of what North Korea is versus South Korea. That's a direct result of America being involved around the world. So that includes not just our military involvement, winning World War II, but it includes our economic development, our aid, our example. I was in Kenya a couple years ago, and I remember going into this village, and it was kind of an agricultural village, and I saw this family that had 2 cows, 3 kids, and a really tiny farm. And I went to this village, and I went to this house, and they began to explain to me how they never used to really know how to take care of the cows, and they didn't produce much milk, and this family was extremely poor. And then a student from the University of Illinois went to this village in Kenya and taught them how to feed the cows, how to properly take care of them, and now they went from making 2 pints of milk a cow a day to way more than that, more than their family needs, so they can take that excess milk now and walk to a co-op that the United States of America built and sell it for excess money, and they feel today like they're rich. They feel like their life was revolutionized. I gotta tell you, just from our national security perspective, you will never recruit a member of a terrorist organization out of a country, out of a village that has been completely transformed by the United States of America like that sees the USA as their hope for the future. And so when we talk about the war on terror, I think it's important to stay on the offense. That's why I think we need to stay in Syria. I think it's important to stay on the offense against ISIS and the next generation of ISIS and the next generation of Al-Qaeda. But the only way we're actually going to win that war in the long run is when terroristic ideology is rejected within their own religion. When the next generation rises up and says, our God that we believe in doesn't represent what you're doing. And you do that through example. You do that through development. You do that through giving hope to the hopeless. The 7, 8, 9-year-old kids right now in the Syrian refugee camps that remember Bashar al-Assad and what they did, that see no hope. Those are the prime recruits for ISIS. when they get of age, because they're told you have nothing to live for, but this is what the Quran says. But if they have an education, and they have hope, and they have opportunity, they won't turn to that. So when I look at the debate that's going on today, and I talk to you guys, it's important to have veterans on the Hill in that perspective. One of the most important things you can bring to this debate and to this talk is when you hear politicians from my party and from the other party talk about bringing everybody home, putting our head in the sand, we're war weary, we're tired, we're worn out. By the way, America, if you think you're war weary, think about the generation after World War II that just lost so many men, turned an entire economy into a war economy, and decided to stay in Europe because the fight was that important. So having 2,000 troops in Syria, we got tragic news today, but being on the offense against ISIS is essential. We don't choose whether we're fighting terrorism. We're fighting terrorism. We do have a choice about where we fight terrorism. So as you go out there and you talk to people, I think the biggest thing you can do, I don't care if you're on the left or you're on the right or somewhere in between, is I think to share your experience of what America represents to areas that are not, that people haven't seen before, people don't understand. When you're sitting here and the weather's bad, sometimes you complain and feel really miserable, but people like us have gone and seen areas where somebody sold a couple pints of milk extra and feel rich now. And it's important to remember that perspective and to remember the role we play. Lastly, I want to say this. What I love about the American military is, if you look at militaries all around the world, I was talking to the ambassador from a European nation who was talking about that nation. This was yesterday, and he said they're having a very hard time recruiting people into their military. And we were trying to get into the details of why. Is it pay? Is it whatever? And he goes, there's no national pride. Nobody joins that military because they're proud to join that military. It's purely economic reasons, because there's no national pride. Now, there are people that join the U.S. military for education benefits, for pay, for a job. That's great. But a lot of people join the military because they're proud. People that go into the Guard and Reserve that don't make a ton of money on a drill week and do it because they want to serve their nation and also still have a civilian job. And I think about my first year I was elected. I'm giving a Purple Heart to a guy who was wounded for the second time in Iraq. He was a sniper. He got wounded in Iraq. I think he was sent to Germany, recovered, went back to Iraq, was shot again, and came home. Since he had been home, he had something like 2 or 3 heart attacks. He was my age. He is my age. He had a wife, 2 kids. And so I'm getting ready to give him this Purple Heart. And I pull him aside. And I said, hey, let me ask you a question. I'm like, do you miss it? Do you miss Iraq? Because I said, to be honest with you, and I feel weird saying it, I go, I miss it every day, which is still true. I miss the people and the mission. And he looks at me and he goes, Congressman, he goes, it's actually interesting you say that. I called my representative at the Army. And he said, I told him they could have all my medals. I'll sign away all my disability. I'll give them I don't have to get retirement. He goes, if they would just let me go back for 1 more year. If they just let me go back for 1 more year. And I thought about that because it obviously affected me and still does. And I'm like, why would he say that? A guy that's had heart attacks, 2 Purple Hearts, why would he say, if they just let me go back? And it's 2 reasons. Because his brothers and sisters were still there. And he wanted to go back and be with them. You meet with anybody, any injured soldier in Walter Reed, and they'll all tell you they wish they were back with their brothers and sisters. That's unique. But the other reason is a guy that's given so much to his country still feels like he has to do more. Still feels like there's more to do. And I gotta tell you, a country like that produces people like that, this malaise we find ourselves in, this licking of our wounds we sit around and find ourselves in, this watching the news about how miserable everything is, we deserve way, way better than that. We deserve better than that from ourselves, and we deserve better than that from our leadership in Washington, D.C., and I put myself in that category as well. We deserve people that stand in front of the American people and remind them every day how lucky they are to be Americans, and how lucky they are that they were born into this country and not somewhere else where they'd have to be worrying about whether a terrorist is going to knock on their door, or a dictator is going to kill their family, or their daughter's going to get stolen and sold into sex trafficking. We live in the greatest country in the world. Remember that and share that belief that you have. I don't care who you talk to. because people need to hear that. And people need to hear that veterans are not wounded puppies that need cuddled, that they're not fragile. These are people that went out, served their nation, did what 99% of the rest of the country would never do. They are tough, battle-hardened people that now, once you're out of the military, you're ready to go do the same kind of thing in a different capacity. So all of you, thank you for being here. God bless you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the time. Thank you.
Please welcome the Hill Vets Lead, Defense Policy Fire Team Chief, and Marine Veteran Charles Lee.